All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Keith DeStone, your host for the Cosmos Online Open House series. And our guest today, our returning guest, since you've been here before, is Dr. Joel Christensen. You are an associate professor and chair of the classics department at Brandeis. You've been a CHS fellow, which is, I think, how we know each other, ultimately. You earned your PhD at NYU, and you've also been at UT San Antonio, as I recall. And you recently co-authored and published a book with Elton Barker, who may be able to join us later in this episode, called Homer's Thebes, with a nice subtitle, which I'll refer to here. Homer's Thebes, Epic Rivalries and the Appropriation of Mythical Pasts, which I love from what I've read so far. So please go ahead with what you have to say.
Keith, when you asked us to give you something to tell people to read today, we gave you a bunch of different things, but we really didn't know what to do because this here, I have the hard copy here so everyone can see the book. This book has a bit of a story behind it, and there's a lot of different things in it. So if it's okay with everyone, I'd just like to tell the story of the book and why it's important to me. And then you can ask questions or we can move to specific examples. Does that seem like a good idea? Can I get a thumbs up?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think that's great.
All right. So, as those of you who've talked to me before know, I'm really into storytelling. And I think one of the things we don't do enough in scholarship is discuss the ways in which the work we do in the world is related to our experiences and the stories that we sort of tell about ourselves. So this book is really important to me and to Elton because it is something that we have worked on for an extremely long time. And it's really shaped and changed with us over a decade or more. So I'm just going to take you way back to 2003. And then move you through the story of the making of the book, and then bring in different aspects of the book and why I think it's important to me and my sort of history as a scholar, but also the way I view the world. If at any point you want to hear more or less about something, just wave your hand and I can stop and go back because I don't have a script, except what's up in here. So Elton and I first met at the Venice International University's Advanced Seminar for the Humanities back in 2003. And it was this weird program, and a phenomenal program still ongoing, where they took young or early career scholars from around the world, primarily Europe and the US, but Israel too. And they put them together on an island in the Venetian lagoon. Called San Servolo, which is where Venice International University is. And we went for 2 years in a row, a month 1 year, 3 weeks the next. And the first year, it was pretty cool. And we were there for Carnival 1 year, which was surreal. And the next year we were there for the ceremony of the remarriage of Venice to the sea. It was an amazing experience, bankrolled by a Venetian bank that was trying to make scholarship central to Venice again. And it was formative in a few ways. One, I got to meet young people doing work from around the world. And I also got to engage with people who are doing work very different from mine. Now, to sort of belie the value of that, Elton and I were both Homerists. And we started to talk about things early on. So we got exposed to the new Archilochus fragment at one of these presentations back in 2003. And our first article together was on that poem and the way it interacts with Homer. And the reason I talk about it is it's the first time where Elton and I really worked out how we think about the interrelations of different poets in the Archaic period. Now, when Elton and I first talked, I think we were hardline about Homer in slightly different ways. So we were both really into oroformulaic theory, but I was definitely less about the idea of the author than Elton was at the time, and we've shifted over our career. But what we were both really serious about thinking about is how we talk about the relationship between different poets and different poetic traditions. Most traditional Homeric scholarship or classical scholarship, when it looks at the way Homer and other poets are related, talk about lyric poets reacting to Homer. And at the beginning, when Elton and I first were reading Archilochus together in the seminar, we said, well, this doesn't make much sense to us. Like, it seems really rigid and not absolutely true to what we understand about the performance culture of ancient Greece, and about the antiquity of other genres. So the first model we really started thinking about was an anti-hierarchical model that imagined that different poets and different poetic genres existed in the same performance marketplace, if you will, or performance culture, and influenced each other as they developed towards textuality. Right. So this is an important thing, is recognizing that the poems we get from Archilochus or Sappho or Tyrtaeus, or even someone later, like Solon, they come out of an oral environment in which they're developing in and against other poetic traditions, right, which aren't necessarily tied to individual authors or individual texts.
Joel, could I interrupt you for a second? About the Archilochus poem, could you give us a brief rundown on that? I'm not sure everyone's familiar.
The new Archilochus poem, and thank you for interrupting me, was radical because it's in elegiac verse. So elegiac couplets, hexameter and then pentameter line. And it tells the story of Telephus, who's Heracles' son. And the story is basically when the Greeks were trying to make it to Troy, they went to Asia Minor, they attacked a city, and it turned out to be the wrong city. It was Mysia, which is just another place where Heracles' son Telephus lives. So in Archilochus's poem, it tells this story, and then has this line basically talking about running away from Telephus and why it's okay. Now, this poem was revolutionary in one way, because people used to say, well, you can't talk about narrative myth in elegy, which is just nonsense. In fact, M.L. West's book about elegy has this list in the beginning where it talks about the 7 contexts that were acceptable for the performance of elegy. And it's so specific that one of the contexts is standing by a fountain, right? Which is just bizarre. Like that's not what I do when I see water, right? And of course, like when we think about poetic or musical genres, they're not restricted to what they talk about in a poem, right? So if you're listening to a hip hop song or a dance song and it's talking about, bumping in the club and drinking 40s or getting high or something, like you can listen to that song while running and not dancing, right? You can clean a house while listening to a song that has to do with something completely different, right? And so for me, this example is important because genre is transferable. It's not about original generation context or performance context. When people hear songs, when people hear stories, they take it with them in different parts of their lives, and it engages with other parts of their lives. And so for me, that has to be a basic truth in ancient Greece, right? People didn't just go to a communal festival and listen to Homer and then put up a wall in their mind and not think about it anymore. They didn't go to the symposium and think about Archilochus and listen to his poems and laugh and then never think of it outside the symposium. Right? So we have really rigid categories for the performance and creation of ancient poetry that to my mind doesn't map onto human lived reality or to the evidence of ancient Greece. So to go back to that poem, by Archilochus, when Elton and I were looking at it for the first time, one of the things we noted was that there were debates about courage and flight and manliness and fame going on in the poem that resonated with what we saw in the Homeric epics. And what we wanted to think about was not, oh, Archilochus is reacting to Homer, which is what people typically say about Archilochus and his famous shield poem. I don't know if you all know the shield poem, but basically Archilochus says, I lost my shield in the bush. Screw it, let somebody else have it. I get to live and get another shield, right? And people typically say this is Archilochus reacting against martial rhetoric. You can see him against Homer, and he may be against Homer, but he's more against an idea about valor and bravery. And so what we wanted to talk about was thinking about different genres engaged in debating different ideas about the value of human life and rhetoric of glory and battle, and to strip away our modern assumptions about which author came first. And what we got from that is a basic emphasis on enriching Homer by imagining not the Homeric poems as the beginning of everything and generating it, but instead as sort of a response to an entire tradition of human storytelling that involved audiences as well as performers. So that was really early on. And the reason I mentioned that is that it sort of put our relationship into play, but also started a conversation between us and the work we were doing about how ancient poetry worked. So that was way back in 2006 or 2005 that article was published. Elton had just finished his PhD and I wasn't done yet. And at the time, I think maybe both of us thought that was the end of our scholarly relationship. But Elton came to visit New York City in 2007, and the period between when I'd finished my dissertation and when I was done with graduate school. And he had to give a couple talks in the city. And when he showed up, he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm giving a talk about the Odyssey and you and I are going to write it. And we have 3 days to do it." So he might remember it a little differently. But at the time, I was living in Astoria, Queens, and we had extreme rain for several days. My apartment started flooding. I was in a basement apartment. And so we're fighting flooding, and we were trying to write an article or paper for him to give at Columbia. And we also took several breaks to watch Battlestar Galactica because he hadn't seen it and it was really important that he get through season 1. All right. So at this time, we said, look, here are some principles that we believe in. One, the relationship of material in the Homeric poems to material outside can't be considered one way or just vertical when it comes to hierarchy. Two, we think that it comes out of performance context that depends on audience reactions and audience knowledge, right? And three, we think that rivalry with other traditions is really important. Because one of the additional things that Elton and I got really interested in over time is why do we have the Iliad and the Odyssey and no other epics? And rather than imagine that it's just pure chance, we posited instead that what if there's something about the Homeric epics that clears everything out of the way or makes other storytelling systems redundant? Now, we didn't make all of this up on our own. There was already a bit of a tradition in work like that of Mark Griffin and others about rivalry in Greek poetry. And so the lens we turned first on the Odyssey was the story of Oedipus and how Odysseus tells the story of Oedipus in a really strange way. What he says is, well, Oedipus killed his dad, married his mom, then his mom killed herself and he had other children and went on ruling in Thebes, which is very different from the famous story most people know, which is that Oedipus blinded himself, his mother hanged herself, and then he left the city. So rather than assuming that the Homeric story was the original, what we decided to think about was, well, what if there is a general Oedipus story and Homer is adapting it to fit the Odyssey's concerns? And so this really set the stage for what we would do with the rest of our book over time, which is to always imagine that what's happening in the Homeric text has nothing to do with what's happening outside of it, that it's all about centering and enforcing and exploring the themes and interests of the Homeric poems in particular. So for the story of Oedipus, where we used the language itself and the themes it activated to really emphasize the ways in which it explored a particularly Odyssean view of the world. And it prized parts of the Oedipus story that made him a suffering hero, that looked at the role of women in the world, and that forced us to think about a returning hero coming to a city and how he governs it. Right. And so that article came out in 2008. So I'm not going to spend the next 45 minutes going through every year of our life. But at that point, we had already outlined, I'll show it again, this book. We came up with the name Homer's Thebes over dinner in 2007 with Matthew Santarocco, who's at NYU. He's like, oh, that's a good book title. And we're like, yes, it is. And then we started to think about different episodes in the Homeric poems that gave us moments to think about the Homeric relation to stories prior to Homer and to stories outside of Homer. And so we did a series of articles. We then did something in 2011 about a scene in book 4 that I had mentioned to Keith, where Agamemnon lays into Diomedes and Sthenelus. Then we did another article about Heracles and one about homecoming. And in 2011, we got together and we outlined the book. And one other big theme became important to our work over this time. And that's the theme of Pan-Hellenism. So as some of you know, the idea of Pan-Hellenism is that there are certain cultural characteristics that the Greeks shared in common. But it's really a veneer over the multiplicity of the different Greek dialects, the different Greek religious beliefs, and the different practices in different cities. So Anthony Snodgrass in, I think, 1971 was the first person to really articulate Pan-Hellenism as the Olympian Games, the oracles in Delos and Delphi, and the Homeric poems. And we can see this reflected in Herodotus and other authors as well. And I think it's really Greg Nage who's been the biggest proponent of looking at Pan-Hellenism as a poetic force as well, and identifying how the Homeric poetry is a pan-Hellenizing force that brings together local traditions. It sort of wipes them out, integrates certain different parts of them, and takes from it what it needs to create sort of an identity all Greeks can sign on to more or less. So for us, this was interesting. This is interesting as a framework because it brings together the idea of poetic rivalry, because we're still talking about genres and topics that are sort of competing for space in audience minds. But it also gives us a model to understand the relationship between the fixity of the Homeric epics we have and their time, right? So there are many different models for the textualization of the Homeric epics. And in the book, we barely talk about it because we want to get away from those things. But you know, I think Nage's evolutionary model, which is one we more or less favor, has gradual levels of fixity developing over time. And one of the big questions is, what are the external and cultural influences that compel a flexible oral tradition to come to greater levels of fixity? And so for us, it's the same things that happen throughout Greece in the 6th and 5th centuries, which is the rise of the other, the idea that there are Persians and other people who put a force on Greeks to unite, and the rise of imperialism in Greece proper. So there's a direct relationship between the textualization of the epics as we have them and Athenian imperialism, and moving on then to greater levels of fixity when you get to the Alexandrian period. So when we looked at that, what we saw is there's a story in Greek storytelling and in the epics about the ability of a cultural narrative to create a unified vision of who the Greeks were. And we wanted to explore that more and see how this worked on different levels. So in the book, we talk about sort of the difference between Hesiodic and Homeric poetry, the Hesiodic poetry being sort of pan-Hellenic, but more pan-Boeotian, so focusing more in the area around Thebes and the Theban city-states there. And the Homeric poems being less about Boeotia and more about Greece in general, but skewing farther towards Athens over time, especially the Odyssey. And Erwin Cook's Odyssey in Athens, I think, is still the best demonstration of the relationship between the content of Homeric epic and the city of Athens. And so I think people will debate the actual dates that we're talking about variously, but I think we have the cultural or the historical force of Greece uniting in theory against Persia, this is conceptually, plus the let's say financial capitalist force of Athens becoming an imperial center. And then we add to that sort of changing cultural standards. One of the stories we don't talk about in the book very much is that cross-culturally, oral traditions are textualized and fossilized when new genres take cultural prominence. So one of the things we're interested in, I think, looking in the future, or at least claiming without investigating anymore, is that the rise of tragedy in Athens as a dominant genre has some influence on the solidification of the Homeric epics in the form we know. So again, going back, this became a central interest as we worked on another text. In 2013, I don't think I have a copy of it here, we published a beginner's guide to Homer. So we outlined this book, Homer's Thebes, and then we promptly started to work on another book, which is exactly the way everybody should do things. And so we published that one, and it really made us to think about looking more widely and selling Homer or explaining Homer to a broader audience. And so I think it's really important that we did that book first. And then we kept working, and life got in the way. Since we outlined the book, we've had 4 children between us, and done very different things in life. We've published a lot of different things, and we work pretty much hand in glove. So one of the other things about this book that's really important to me is that it's not really mine or Elton's, right? It belongs to someone completely different, right? There's not one page that was written by him and not me, right? Every bit of this book was part of a shared document in Dropbox that each of us wrote and rewrote like hundreds of times. So we have the convenience of being able to blame the other one when it goes wrong. But the fact is that we spent so much time working on it that this is really something of its own. And we also wrote different things. We wrote for other people until we got to this book. And so the book has become now 2 very different things. First, the opening chapter, the introduction, lays out different ways of reading the Homeric epics, connected with various modern literary theories. And this became important for us because one of the things that's happened over the past 15 or 20 years in Homeric scholarship is that neo-analysis has risen again, and models of reading have gotten a little more restrictive in our opinion. So we try to lay out pretty clearly what we think the different models of reading are. And I mean reading in general, not just reading Homer. And then we move towards why we think the models we apply to Homer are the best way of approaching it. So that introduction to me is the clearest way that I or Elton, alone or together, have ever laid out how we think the Homeric epics should be read in the modern world. And I think that, to me, it's something I'll probably return to because I'll mess it up again. I have to remind myself. And then following that, there are a bunch of test cases that really move thematically through different parts. So it's work we've started and finished in other places before, and then sort of revisited and revised for this. So there's a chapter on Oedipus, one on Heracles, one on politics with Diomedes and Agamemnon. And then we move into a thematic chapter where we get into some stuff we originally hadn't planned. And we talk about the relationship between epic rivalry as an aesthetic and the contents of Homeric poems. And in the final chapter, before the conclusion, we really talk about Panhellenism, and we use some different examples to illustrate it. The sort of central example in one of them is about a Orchomenian hero, Erginos, and the mythographical relationship between him and Heracles, and how it helps us explore how myths are sort of compounded together, how they appropriate from one another, and how they're used as cultural discourse to enforce certain points of view on the world. And so that's, before I turn over to questions, that's the biggest thing that's changed, I think, in our approach to Homer over the last decade. And that's understanding the impact that the Homeric epics had as products and producers of cultural discourse over time. Right? They emerge out of a certain set of values, but they also function to enforce and explore those values. And to me, that's become a crucial framework for understanding epic. This is not the time to talk about it, but I have another book coming out in November about psychology and the Odyssey. And this basic framework of understanding that the Homeric epics both are a result of a way of viewing the world and a way of reinforcing that view is something that Elton and I have struggled with over time, but has really become sort of a centerpiece in the way we view poetry in the ancient world. So that's the story of the book. We proposed it to CHS way back in 2011, and we didn't deliver it to them until 2017, right at the end. And then they had to clean it up because we had about 18 different citational methods. We had different spellings because Elton's so British and I'm inconsistent. And so it took a while to clean it up, but we're really happy that it came out because it's free to read, which is really important to us. Open access is really important. And it also gets to be on a page with some of the books that have most influenced us. When I scroll through on the CHS publications, it's like a greatest hits of work that I love. And there's something pretty special about having your own work in that list. So that's the overview of the book, sort of my life experience with it. I can keep going, but I'd love to have some questions if any of you have any right now. Jackie, first. You're muted still.
Okay. Hi, Joel.
Hi.
It was interesting for me, especially, and probably for Sarah, that you, the citations that you have for reading was from the Odyssey Scroll 11, because just a few months ago, we were close reading Scroll 11, which I had never really done before. Usually 11, especially, oh, here's all the women, go, like another women's catalog of ships. Right. But when we close read it, several things struck us that really sound like, I presume that you're talking about, because when he describes all these women, first they're the wives and consorts of kings and so they're important families, and they all, not all, many slept with God. So he's invoking not only the myths behind these women, but their heroic stature, their association with a lot of the heroes. So it seemed like he was associating himself with that whole tradition, heroic tradition. So in some ways, in order to, because he's describing this to Achanos and the whole gang there. So it sounded like he's using myth, which the whole audience knows, to validate sort of his position in the epic. And then at the same time, reciprocally, you could, when you really close read and do a little research into these super compressed myths, you see how, at least we thought, how those myths are inspiring him in his stories from there on, not only the Cretan myths with Minos, but other, and I can't remember all of them, but other incidences where you go, oh, that's where he got it. It's that myth. So it's like a great modern comedian like Jonathan Winters, Robin Williams. They have this really menu of kind of things, and they just embellish it to make it new again. And I just see what he was doing. Do you?
Well, I love the way you put it, because there are a couple things that you said that get to the heart of what's happening in Book 11, but also into the sort of the Homeric relationship to other traditions. So one is the very act of listing things into a catalog makes them all seem roughly equal as entries vis-a-vis one another. So that's one thing. Like, and all of these stories are local traditions important to particular cities and the families who are in those cities, and trace their genealogies back. So it's a double-sided thing. So one part of it is honoring the local tradition. It's a shout out to the
exactly the words are used.
But it's also subordinating it, because one of the things that people often miss out when reading Book 11 is that you start with a list of mothers, right? It's a list of mothers or consorts and the heroic men related to them. But we forget that the first mother mentioned and the first one who appears is Odysseus's mother. She gets a longer amount of time, right? And her suffering and experience is given personal voice. She's not just an entry in a catalog. And then in the second half of 11, Odysseus gives all the heroes, and the final one is Heracles. And that seems like always giving Heracles a place of honor until you realize that Heracles is really just there to talk about the fact that Odysseus suffered just like he did. But the Odyssey does this amazing thing where it makes Odysseus the first entry in the list of heroic sons and the last entry in the list of heroic figures. And so it really masters the tradition, integrates it into a whole, levels everything else out, and makes Odysseus the most important person. Right. And so to me, this is it's a perfect example of the Homeric strategy of expropriating, of subordinating to its own needs. And you actually don't need to know anything about those other traditions, right? Because you came away and you couldn't remember it all. But what you did remember was Odysseus giving a catalog of all the heroines. And if you wanted to be like, you know, a 3rd century Alexandrian scholar or a German scholar for the 19th century, you could look them all up, right? But they just become sort of background noise, ornamentation for the glory of the Odyssey. And the second thing that's in there, I don't want to talk too long, is it's not just about appropriating from rival mythical traditions. It's also about mastering a different type of genre. So we know from Hesiod, from the Hesiodic catalog of women, and from other traditions, that there were genres of genealogical catalogs. Some of them focused around giving out women's or being matriarchal in nature. Right? And so the Homeric poems, which are really patriarchal in nature, address this by absorbing that genre and by making Odysseus the singer of the genre of the catalog of women. So it subordinates the genre, right? It takes it and it competes with it by doing it one better. You know, if you think about it as a historical rap battle, right? The Homeric Odyssey has taken over and done even better what might have been in the genealogical catalog.
Sorry, I just said one follow-up. What you just said, I think, is reinforced because it struck that he was very precise about how they had to line up one by one, the women, and then later on, and then later on in the boats in Scylla, the island of Helios, he describes these crew members lining up one by one to the best of the So I thought that reinforced it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, is it Helena or Helene? What do you say? You're muted.
It's Helene. Hello.
Nini, how are you?
Fine, thank you. I was, as we were talking about the Odyssey, because I like the Odyssey very much, as Jackie knows as well, we have discussed about the Odyssey. And so when we were talking, I was reading the chapter suggested from your book about the Theban presence in the Odyssey, and especially in scroll 11. And I wanted to, I think that the Theban presence here is both Heracles, which is not also is a model for Odysseus in the sense that these 2 lines, I think it is 2 lines, they say that Heracles says that he got out of Hades with the help of Athene and of Hermes. And it is essentially a model for Odysseus because Odysseus reaches Ithaca with the help of Athene and of Hermes, essentially, not only of Athene. Yes, so Heracles is not just one person who made it out of Hades. He is essentially the model for Odysseus, the Theban model for Odysseus. And also Tiresias, the seer, who is the one, in the underworld, he is the one who, Odysseus goes to the underworld explicitly to take the thesphata, the commandments, what the gods command, from the mouth of the Theban seer. So these both Theban figures.
Yeah, it's double.
Yeah, and they give very important directions for Odysseus.
Yeah.
So the Theban pre-history of Odyssey it's like setting guidelines for Odysseus for what he has to do, or they lend their prestige, we could say, to Odysseus, to the Odyssey.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I like that corrective because it takes back to a part of the introduction that I didn't talk much about, which is we answer the question or ask the question of why Thebes? Why is the city of Thebes important? And as you rightly point, there's a lot of honor and prestige associated with the city of Thebes in early Greek myth, right? It's ground zero for gods, right? Dionysus is from there, Heracles is associated with it, Oedipus is from there, and this continues to the Athenian period, where about 33% of the extant and lost plays that we have were centered in Thebes in some way, right? So I think that the records we have show that there were epics set in Thebes. There's a lost play. We have a couple of plays. There's a lost epic we have fragments of called the Thebes. And according to several ancient authors, it was the best epic that wasn't the Iliad or the Odyssey. And so one of the things we talk about later in the book is how the themes of that may have corresponded to the themes we see in our epic. So I think that in 11, the Odyssey, our Homeric Odyssey, is definitely looking at the world in which Thebes is important and making Thebes prior to it. And one of the models that we use in this book comes from examination of Greek poetry in general. And that model or that device that we talk about is called the anticipatory doublet. And the basic structural element of Greek poetry that we talk about is that Greek poetry will float one idea. And then the second idea, the second sequence in it, will build upon it, but superseded by being more important, right? So it's like a binary relationship. And I think that the Homeric epics are constantly positing that the Theban epics are before them, and that they build upon them, but they're more important than they are. That makes sense?
Didn't hear you well.
I'm sorry. There's a lot of background noise coming from.
Yeah, I missed the most important part, but I will get it. I will review the video, so okay. I will. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do you have another question? Helena, can you put your mute back on? Because I think we're getting some feedback from your channel. There we go. Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anne, I saw that you had a question.
Yes, I have. Thank you. Thank you for making your book free to us to read. And I did enjoy it. My question really is a methodological one, particularly in the way you presented your talk as well. I thought, and that is, how did you identify these two themes that you write about rivalry and Panhellenism? It seems to me they come from quite a messy collection of experiences and discussions and readings. So how can you then identify just those two as your important themes? Because I came up with another one.
Okay, well, first, can you tell me the other one? And then I'll try to grade all three together.
Well, I was interested in succession, and particularly in patriarchal succession.
All right, so I'll get to that in just like 10 seconds, or maybe a little longer. So I think that, rivalry and Panhellenism are probably two larger categories into which we fit a lot of different themes, okay? And the way we came to them is, early on, we saw that rivalry was the definitive aesthetic and compositional impact on Greek poetry that's different from certain other genres, right? And it's a big part of Greek culture. And, I think Elton and I are both rather undogmatic at times. So if in 5 years people said, well, there's no proof for this rivalry, you made it all up, I would say, all right, I guess I need to look at it again. So part of it was like, let's explore this principle of rivalry and see how far it takes us. Right. And I think that it's connected as well to Panhellenism, because the question that we have is, how does the idea of a collective identity develop in a place in which there's no center? And so for me, that's one of the most challenging things about teaching ancient Greece and explaining it to the modern world, because we live in a time of nation states, of single languages united by media, and of religious doctrines and traditions united by revelatory texts, right? None of these things existed in ancient Greece. So their concept of unity was radically different from ours. And a lot of what we are told about ancient Greece in classes and what we've learned actually comes from an imposition of modern views on the ancient world, right? So ancient Greece was really a multiplicity with a unity as a veneer, right? There are many different dialects. There are 100 city-states with different political systems, different calendars, different ritual beliefs, yet somehow we get this one text, right? Or this one author, Homer, that appealed to everybody, which is strange. Like tragedy only happened in Athens, only, right? But Homeric poetry was espoused and embraced by many different places. So rather than assuming that that's just because Homeric poetry was good and nothing else was as good, I thought, well, what if we, Elton and I said, well, what if we instead imagine Homeric poetry as like that figure from Star Trek, the Borg, right? It goes around adapting and stealing and mastering everything else, right? And for this to happen, I think rivalry would have to be a central part. Now we can think of this in terms of cultural expropriation instead of the term rivalry, right? And I think this goes to your question of succession exactly, right? Because some of the things we're talking about have to do with succession, matriarchy to patriarchy, which is a cultural difference, but also succession of different genres by others, right? Of the genealogical genre being taken over by an epic narrative genre, right? A didactic genre like that of the Works and Days being superseded by a more narrative mimetic genre like that of the Homeric epics. And so I think that succession is definitely there. And one part of it, it has to do with the story of the cycle of the ages of man. And so one of the passages I brought out is this passage that happens in Hesiod's Works and Days, where it says that the race of heroes was wiped out, fighting first with the flocks of Oedipus and then around the city of Troy for the sake of Helen. And it's very clear here that we're getting a succession myth. Now, it's not succession in the terms of progress that we think in the modern world, not that we're actually making that much progress as human beings, right? But we're moving from a world of gods into a world of human beings. And the Iliad and the Odyssey are intimately integrated into that cycle, right? If you start out the beginning of the Iliad, line 9 or whatever it is ends, Dias deteleato boule, and thus the will of Zeus was being completed. Everything in the Iliad is in this framework, is in the divine plan to wipe out the race of heroes, right? The gods are intimately involved in the action and they're interested in it, right? We get divine action in book 1, we get book 24 starting with a divine trial about whether or not Achilles did a bad thing mistreating Hector's body, right? The Odyssey is very different. There's only one god who's really involved a lot, and that's Athena, and most of the other deities have receded. And Odysseus is a human being, right? You can trace his line either to Hermes or Zeus if you go different ways, but his mother is not a goddess. And at the end of the Odyssey, it's a very unmagical world, right? With the exception of the divine intervention that ends the poem. It's a struggle between a king and his aristocrats for who's going to rule the city. So I think what's actually happening there is the Odyssey and the Iliad are involved in a very much larger succession myth that explains a movement away from a divine realm into one where there are only mortals. And one thing I'll add to that is the Odyssey starts with a much different statement on the relationship between man and God than the Iliad. So the Iliad says, Dias teleato boule, will of Zeus is being completed. The Odyssey at line 31, 32 has Zeus looking down, right? Shaking his head and declaring, mortals, they're always blaming the gods for their fate when they make it worse through their own recklessness. right? And this is a very different statement about human agency and responsibility. And so I think that the Iliad and the Odyssey aren't just pan-Hellenic texts. They're not just rivalrous, pan-generic texts, but they're also epics that explain, they're cultural moments that explain the relationship between man and God and the division between the realms. And so I think that your point on sort of generational succession is really well put, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Thank you.
Other questions, or did I just wear everyone out?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking in relation to that, you said that a lot of the actions that Diomedes stuff was political.
Mm.
And I've written, but what is the polis?
Yeah.
What is it? Because my tradition is English socialist feminism,
yeah.
where you can identify economic classes and genders and all the rest of it from years ago. But what is it here? Is it ethnicity? Is it the class of warriors? Is it what is the
really
polis?
didn't talk about politics in the Iliad for a long time because of this very question. Right. The first person, I think, in the last generation to do it convincingly and sort of powerfully is Dean Hammer in his book, The Iliad as Politics. And his argument is essentially that what is political in the Iliad is that human beings are engaged both in using collective institutions and in questions about how to govern themselves. Right. So the Iliad has two political institutions that we know from history were common throughout Greece. One is the assembly or the ecclesia of all the citizens, and the other is the sort of smaller aristocratic boule or council. And this is clear in the agora scenes in the Iliad, and then the council scenes, where language is used in very different ways to sort of create collective identities in the assembly, and then pursue plan making in the council. And then the second component to this is I think that the Odyssey is secretly a really political text. If you think about the experiences of audiences in the 6th and 5th century BCEs, one of the things that you have going on throughout the Mediterranean in the 6th century is the formation of city-states in a way that didn't exist before. Right? So something's going on in the air then, because we have the traditional foundation of Rome and Athens, so refoundation of Athens around the same time. And then you have political upheaval and with formation of democracies, oligarchies, monarchies in Greece throughout the 6th and 5th centuries. And I think that the audiences of epic would have heard the political narratives in ways that we don't, because we see political action differently. Right. So the end of the Iliad, the Odyssey, it's about aristocratic and oligarchic factions struggling against a king who may not be doing a terrible job. I think he's doing a terrible job and he murdered all those people. It's definitely a political question. It's about how you distribute the goods of the state and distribute power. And the Iliad is a question of, if you take a bunch of nobles and you have to do something collectively together, how do you distribute worth? How do you distribute honor? And how do you adjudicate disputes? So that's how I think of it as being about politics.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Other questions? Yes, the other? You want
to? Elin.
Elin? Right.
Yes. I don't know if it's a question, but it's about the catalog of ships. Okay. Yeah. In your book about the no mention of Thebes, but the mention of Lower Thebes, you know, you write that as if Thebes were the city that ought not to be named.
Yeah.
So that I find really interesting. So could you talk a little bit more about that, about the non-mention of Thebes and the, you know?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there are many moments in the book, in the Iliad or the Odyssey, where Thebes is not mentioned, but other locations are. And it's the conspicuous absence of the city at these certain points that's led us to believe for a long time that the Iliad doesn't want to mention Thebes, right? And so there are also poetic formulas that are typical to Thebes outside of Homer that are used for Troy or other cities. There's that thing where Andromache comes from a different Thebes that's got a slightly different name. So I think that there is definitely an attempt to control when and where the audience is directly told to think of Thebes and when it's just left as an implication, right? So when we get to the catalog of ships is a bizarre masterpiece to begin with, in who gets emphasis and who doesn't, right? I think it's really fascinating that Athens isn't a bigger deal in the catalog. And it's also important that the two major heroes of the epic tradition are guys from nowhere places, right? Thea is way up there, and Ithaca, we can't even agree where it is anymore. And so I think this is an intentional political move to make as central marginalized heroes or heroes from marginalized places so as to not give too much honor. But the ancients were really sensitive to this. There's this fabulous story about the conflict between Athens and Megara over the ownership of the island Salamis. And apparently, so according to this story, Solon went to Megara to argue about it, and he recited a line from the catalog of ships saying that Ajax went with Salaminian troops after the contingents of Athens. And then the Megarians brought out a bunch of boys and men who did a dance and sang the part of the catalog that said the same exact thing about Megara, right? And this shows up in Plutarch. And so these were places of contest in the ancient world, right? Where people really listened to the details. And according to Plutarch, it was so important that you could not even name Megara, right? Or sorry, not even say Salamis was under Athens, but it was just as important to say these lines came next to the Athenian lines, right? So people were that attuned to the small details, the note not heard as opposed to the one sounded. And so I think that naming or not naming matters. And as we know from the Odyssey, not naming is a huge thing, right? When Odysseus is named or not named, these types of word play, word absences were things audiences were tuned into. Anybody else? Yeah, Bill, how you doing, Bill? It's been a while.
Good. Hey, I was wondering about your belief that Odyssey and the Iliad survived for a reason.
Yeah.
You want to go into that?
Sure. So I think that there are a couple things. I think that they were so successful at wiping out successors that nothing else was left. But I think there are multiple aspects to this. Part of it is always going to be accident, right? The accidents of transmission. But works of art like this, when they're written down, they need a lot of money and influence behind them to perpetuate them. So I think one of the things that people often underestimate when they think about the transmission of the Iliad and the Odyssey into text from performance is that it was very labor intensive, that it took a lot of material to write it down, and that a lot of copies weren't made in the beginning. And secondly, that people wouldn't just suddenly read them, right? So there's a woman, a Danish scholar named Minna Skafted Jensen, who's written a book called Writing Homer. And I think Greg Naj wrote a pretty mean review of it. But I think what's important about the book that she notes is that if the epics were written down, they were probably put in a place that was sacred and then not read again for a long time, right? So we didn't suddenly go from performance context to making a transcript of the text to suddenly publishing it and have people reading it all the time, right? That just didn't happen, right? So the way I see it is that we have sort of threefold influence. Right? One, the aesthetics of ancient epic with us that they tried to expropriate from and eliminate rivals. Two, you have imperialist and interest in the creation of an authoritative Homer, right? But in a period in which it wouldn't be likely for people to copy it and read it anyway. But three, I think connected to the first principle, the aesthetics, is that I think the Iliad and the Odyssey, when they were formed in the form we have, actually answer all the important questions of ancient Greek life, right? I think in totality, through metonymic and associative ways, they tell all the stories, or at least purport to. So my argument would be, why do you need anything else? And so I think that's where part of the enduring success comes from, is as a process of being part of the Pan-Hellenic tradition, and also being having rivalry and appropriation as an essential part of its compositional DNA. The epics came to tell the full story of human life. All right, so for me, the Iliad is about how to fight, how to die, and what to fight and die for. And the Odyssey is how to live when you don't get the option of dying, right? And what life is like after the age. And of course, the two intermesh, and they're complementary. They disagree with each other, but they really speak to the totality of human life at the time. And I think beyond that, Bill, I think probably other epics were performed, right? But the center of Greek intellectual life moved, right? So I think we really have to think about how different performance genres like tragedy change expectations, and then how the move of money and power and scholarship to the Hellenistic libraries, not just at Alexandria, but at Seleucia, Antioch, and Pella, exported Greek culture, and was no longer being performed in oral in those places, but written down. I think Greek verse making in an oral context continued outside of Athens, outside of Antioch, outside of Alexandria, but it didn't get written down because it no longer encountered that potent mix of political power, economic power, and sort of change in culture from one performance genre to another. Does that help answer those? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think particularly the Hellenistic libraries, I can see that argument.
Yeah, it's a really powerful moment. And I mean, and you take one genre, right, and you change it into something else, the audiences who are reading Homer weren't the audiences who are listening to it. So one of the arguments I've had with some people recently is how pervasive Homer actually was in the ancient Mediterranean. And I think it was only a very small percentage of people who ever read the epics as a whole. You would read excerpts, you would memorize lines, but very few people actually had access to 24 books.
Right, makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. Keith, how are we doing?
We're doing great. It's time to wrap it up, though. So I will just thank you again for this very illuminating conversation with us. I feel so much smarter about Epic now.
And everyone, thank you for listening. If you have questions, my email is, as always, joel@brandeis. And I know the book's free, so please enjoy it for free. But if you purchase it, I get no money, but CHS gets money to publish more books online. So it's affordable. It comes out March 17th. So if you can purchase a copy, do it, so that the next person like me can publish for free online and you can enjoy it. All right.
Thanks for the plug. All right. Thanks you all for joining us.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care.